What's up, everybody? It is Andrew Cleary here of the F1 podcast, bringing you season 3, episode 7. Today, fortunately, John can't make it to our podcast episode this week, but you have the dynamic duo of myself and Erica. Erica, how are you doing?
I'm doing swell. How are you, Andrew?
Not too bad. You know, we are recording on Tuesday, March 28th, and a lot has happened in the past week or so in Formula One. So we figured we'd do this kind of week in 30, so to speak, talk about the details, spill some tea, as you may, and then discuss kind of our initial thoughts of the Aussie GP this weekend in Melbourne. Actually, wasn't too bad of an accent there.
No, that was actually pretty good. It's much better than when we attempted to do that last year.
Yeah, Dan and I. But or I don't know if it's as good as the Sebastian Vettel. This is a knife.
That's a knife.
That's not a knife.
Rendition. Yeah. But did you see the video of Danny Rick driving through Australia? How cool was that?
On a tractor? Is it that one that you're talking about?
Well, he was driving tractor. He was driving like the old RB8, I think, through the desert and through the streets of all across Australia.
No, okay, that's not the one I saw. The one I saw was a subtle dig at McLaren, wherein he is driving an orange tractor, not very fast.
Do a barrel roll.
I think $18 million, and he has the same amount of points this year as both Lando and Piastri.
I was sad McLaren let him go, but whatever. It's the right call for him. Let's be real.
It is what it is, and we'll talk about McLaren a little bit later on in this episode. But first and foremost, we're going to talk about the week that was / the F1 gossip. Spill the tea, Erica. Christian Horner came out earlier this week in a Sky Sports podcast or Sky Sports interview, stating that, you know, what Lewis has, talking about how RB or Red Bull can't accommodate Lewis Hamilton in their team moving forward. I don't know if that's a shock to you, but it's not really a shock to me.
It was definitely not a shock to me to hear that. I mean, I think a lot of people last year kind of questioned, you know, like if Paris's contract came up, would Lewis Hamilton jump ship and go to Red Bull with the better car? I think Lewis is so established. I really doubt that they would do any kind of movement there. Like, it just doesn't make sense. I also don't think that Red Bull really would have the salary for it. Like, Perez is a steal compared to Lewis, I have to imagine, when it comes to contract negotiations. But
yeah, and you know, he mentioned something about like when Lewis has achieved in Formula One is second to none, but they're very happy with the drivers they have, and why wouldn't they be, right? You know, you have the top 2 drivers in the the Drivers' Championship right now, and they look like they're going to have quite a significant intra-battle squad, and I think Checo can really show what he's made of throughout the season. So I'm not surprised by this, but a question that kind of bodes to is, I can never see Lewis in a Red Bull. You know, like in a Red Bull uniform at all. And like, what other F1 driver / constructor pairings could you just not see happen, period?
Ooh, excellent question. What drivers and or pairings could I not see happen? Well, you know, I've seen some of the weird Stan accounts going around Twitter this week, and one that everyone has paired up, but I just can't see happening, is Pierre Gasly and Charles Leclerc being on a team.
Why is that?
Just as much as I think they get along, and we've seen that a lot in some of the banter in the paddock and behind the scenes and stuff, I just don't feel like they mesh well. And even though Pierre had his chance at Red Bull and then moved back to AlphaTauri and is now with Alpine, I think he's too hungry and would not be willing to follow the team orders. And we know that I, in my opinion, at least, Charles would be the one of the two of them to most likely have that first seat. And I don't think that he's willing to accommodate that. I think there'd be a lot of animosity. And I also just, I'm having a hard time picturing Charles anywhere other than Ferrari. And I don't see Pierre as a Ferrari driver. Like, he came up in the Red Bull Academy. That would just be, I know Carlos Sainz did too, but like, it would just be so weird to me to see that switch.
For me, I think the most blasphemous one would be if Verstappen ended up going to Mercedes. Like, just completely going against like everything that he stood for, and like the fight between him and Lewis for like the past 4 or 5 years, to like join the dark side as you may, would be quite an interesting story.
I would love to see, if that ever did happen, the conversation that would end up going down between Christian Horner and Toto Wolff afterward. Oh, no. Christian, it's just a car race. He just wants to drive the car. Like,
And then yeah, instead of changing the effing car, they changed the driver, but they need to change the effing car, as Christian alluded to earlier. But continuing on the Red Bull side, it appears that Chief Technology Officer Adrian Newey's contract, according to Tom Clarkson, is expiring soon. And the interesting thing, Erica, was I didn't know this, but Red Bull hires Newey through his own kind of consulting company or his own third-party company, and therefore his costs are exempt from the cost cap.
What?
Yeah. So while all these F1 teams out here playing checkers, Red Bull playing chess with their CTO.
Kidding. I'm so surprised to hear that that's exempt, because as much as I kind of get it. I mean, contractors are always treated a little different regardless of where you work, but that's a very key position with a lot of expenditure from Red Bull. And so even if he's not like an employee and it's not like a salary or whatever in the same way as everything else, I would think that because he's contributing significantly to what's going on, that would go toward the cost cap.
And, it's such an interesting loophole to circumvent the cap, because you almost kind of wonder if teams are now going to start doing this where, their CTOs or their technical directors are going to start creating their own kind of individual proprietorship companies as a third-party contractor, and then at that point they're going to hire them. So again, something for the FIA to take a look at potentially on how teams might find these loopholes, circumvent the cap so that they can maximize their dollars moving forward. But do you see Adrian going anywhere else but Red Bull?
Honestly, he's been pretty quintessential to their operations for quite a while now. I mean, we've seen some weird stuff happen this year already. I know we'll talk about a little bit later, but we've seen Ferrari's head aerodynamicist kind of signing on elsewhere. People like with McLaren, I think it was, we're seeing some weird shifts. We saw all those team principals move around last year. Not that they were team principals that we couldn't see moving to different teams. It's what we talked about with like Mercedes, Ferrari, and Red Bull, right? Like they're such powerhouses and they're such machines with like long-standing history and tradition over the course of at least the last 20 years, if not longer, especially for some of the other teams. So I just don't see it.
He's been with them since like 2006.
Yeah.
They have such a good connection there. And look how he's been able to formulate a car where in a quote unquote new generation has completely like done the Mercedes, what they did in the hybrid era, and just taken over the dominance. So you would like to think like Red Bull is going to match / exceed every offer that Newey gets, especially if they continue to find this loophole, because the money doesn't matter at that point.
Exactly. I'm curious, was this a widely known thing before this article was published that it was out of the cost cap?
Personally, I didn't know. And if it probably did enough diving, maybe that's the case, but it's kind of like one of the first times that I've seen it for the cost cap. And I wonder if teams are going to start using that model more so, because it'll have to come to a point where, okay, if you do your CTO is that, then what other key positions are you going to be off the cost cap that you can go to then reallocate that quote unquote resource to the car development, right? So I think FIA will probably come in and make a ruling on it sooner rather than later, just because of all the cost cap issues that they had recently. Speaking of which, Red Bull, I saw something on Twitter where Red Bull ordered Domino's pizza to their Melbourne paddock this past week, and I'm like, man, catering must be taking a real big hit if that's the case.
They're worried about spending too much now, after last year they got that slap on the wrist and they don't want to risk it.
Like, no knock on Domino's. I think Domino's is probably one of the top echelon pizza spots that you get that's like chained, in my opinion, but I just think it's kind 100%. Of funny they go from catering to Domino's.
As long as they get the cheesy bread, I think everyone's happy though. So
they have this new stuffed cheesy bread in the US. Oh my goodness. When I went to vacation there to Disney in January, we ended up doing Domino's one night because we had to like save some money somehow. And they had this stuffed cheesy bread. Oh my God, out of this world.
Bring that shit to Canada.
So I think with that, we can then jump, because we've been alluded to Mercedes a little bit. There was some interesting news about Mercedes and their kind of colossal failure, let's put it that way, in their team. where according to Toto Wolff, he says it might take 6 to 12 months to catch up to Red Bull's depth of understanding the aerodynamic details in order to maximize the performance of the current generation of the F1 cars. Erica, that's kind of a long time.
Yeah, I'm really surprised to hear that because obviously they had issues last year with the new car introduced and a much lesser funded team with that is just newer in general. Like Aston Martin is as much as, you know, it's purchased and rebranded and all that stuff, it is a new team. Has seemed to turn it around in less time than Mercedes has. And so it begs the question, what is going on?
Yeah, and they quoted that too also how like they had some fault, like there was faulty data experience within the wind tunnel testing, and that they need to do some upgrades to the wind tunnel in order to unlock the performance. But I like look at the car design. You were the only team to not have a freaking side pod on your car. And, you know, if you're the only team, you either get it right or you get it purely wrong. Mm-hmm. And they got it purely wrong, but they've maintained this concept. So they really need to kind of take a look at the drawing board here and take a look at, you know, internally and figure out what they need to start changing the concept or thought internally first.
And I sit there and I'm kind of wondering at this point, like, classic problem a lot of people run into is that escalation of commitment. Like, well, we've already invested this much going down the route without the side pods or with whatever design we've picked at this point in time. We can't change course now. But that's such a bad way to go about it because it doesn't matter what industry you're in. Like, it's proven that really you should just cut your losses and do what needs to be done in order to go the right way. So curious if this is just kind of like someone making a very basic management decision error, or if it's truly that they had horrific wind tunnel data that led them astray and is continuing to lead them astray into the 2023 season. So my hope is that it doesn't take them that long to turn it around, because obviously we would all like to see Lewis get that 8th championship. I don't think it really matters whether or not you're a fan of his. That's just a pretty spectacular feat. But also, like, I want to see George do well. He's a young guy. He deserves the chance to succeed.
Especially when he came from Williams, who was a tough part of his career, and he really tried to push that car into another level that, you know, we didn't think it was ever going to get to in the previous era. And he was able to do that, right, with his qualifying performances on Saturday and scoring team points for the first time in a couple of years. And then, you know, you go to this juggernaut of Mercedes, who has completely dominated the previous era of F1, and you think that at that point, okay, that continuation trend should be the case, as with Red Bull did, right? Like they were in the same position as Mercedes fighting for the championship in 2021, and yet they were still able to develop a car that is miles ahead in terms of performance compared to Mercedes. So that's what really shocks me. Mm-hmm. It's because everyone had to do the change from you know, where the downforce is really goes from the nose to the floor. And you'd think, you know, with the technology that Mercedes had, with the internal expertise that they had, that they would able to grasp that concept. And it's just kind of eye-opening and mind-boggling that they haven't been able to do that at all.
Truly, yeah, absolutely mind-boggling.
If you're a Mercedes fan, deep breath. There's more pain ahead.
You lose.
But like, if your pain is finishing 5th and 6th, or like scratching for a potential podium every weekend, I think that you're in a pretty good spot.
It could be worse.
If that's the worst.
Yeah.
Yeah. Because it could be really worse. You could be a team. You could be a team in papaya.
You could be a McLaren fan like myself.
Do a barrel roll.
Yes. So amidst the colossal, like the absolute shamble, debacle, whatever you want to call it, of the past 2 GPs that McLaren have done.
Womp womp.
Yeah, they are doing a full technical team shakeup.
It's nuts, the number of changes that we're seeing come in, because we already saw a replacement in terms of the aerodynamics team, but we're also seeing a split in the technical on the racing side, from being controlled like for all of the racing into each individual stream. So like Indy has its own kind of technical side, F1's going to have its own, rally, etc. But it goes beyond that as well.
Yeah, it looks like James Key is out after kind of what happened in Saudi Arabia, but Sanchez is in. Peter Perdomo and Neil Hoodley are going to head the concept, aerodynamics, and engineering and design teams there at McLaren. And they've also hired in Mariana Alperin, who was formerly our senior aerodynamist.
Yeah, I was surprised that there was that move from Aston Martin to McLaren, but
So stop poaching my fucking team.
you know
Erica.
what?
Barrel roll.
I'm gonna take him where I can get him. Too effing bad, and deal with it.
You lose.
Because of
good.
course I have control over these decisions. That's just the way it works.
I thought you had Zach Brown on speed dial.
You know what? I did, but he got a new phone and he's still with AT&T and they made him get a new cell phone number. So yeah.
Maybe get a burner phone after these past couple of races too.
Yeah, I don't want to blame him for it. That's for sure.
Well, here's the quote that Zach Brown had. He said, "It has been clear for me for some time that our technical development has not moved at a quick enough pace to match our ambition of returning to the front of the grid. I am pleased that having completed a full review of Andrea, we are now able to implement the restructuring required to set the wheels in motion to turn this around. Technical development, yes, terrible technical development throughout the year. They didn't meet their development goals. You know, they were very far back, and being 2-3 races into the season, it's a little too late. No."
I'm really curious to see what's going to happen because even since the first race, McLaren has been saying that in Baku, we'll be seeing basically the start of the McLaren season, in that they'll have an upgrades package that's supposed to make them more competitive and at least return them to where we would kind of expect them to be on the grid. But at the same time, if their development has been so behind, this really puts a damper on my hopes for it. So in my mind, I've kind of already given up on this season for the papaya.
Erica, trust me, I know how that feels with watching sports teams. And I think what the annoying part too is that in a way, there was no kind of coming out from McLaren saying that we weren't going to be as competitive as we thought we were last year in terms of like, a lot of people are saying, it was Ricardo's issue. If they had a second driver that could score better than Ricardo, they could have beaten Alpine for P4. For sure. Totally agree with that. But the thing, like, I don't know, do you felt there was a lot of promises going into this year that they would have a better car, especially with Piastri now, and it's completely gone 180?
Yeah, I feel like there were a lot of conversations, a lot of excitement around it. I mean, obviously, signing Piastri, where a lot of people wanted to get him on their team. Like, there was no question about it. As much as Alpine wanted him, there was interest from other teams too, because he's a phenomenal driver. And especially because last year was a building year for McLaren and they had been racier in 2020. I think everyone expected them to be back where they were in 2020 this year. And they have drastically under-delivered on that. And I feel really bad for Piastri because I think moving to McLaren, he thought he was going to go to a team that was going to get him the points and get him higher up the grid when he was in one of the two seats. And that's just not happening.
Yeah, and they really need to figure it out ASAP because I know Lando has signed like a multi-year deal with them, but they have a tight rope to walk because especially, and also a team like Ferrari with Leclerc, right? These young guns who have the quality to win world championships or potentially have the quality world championships are going to be taking the back seat to Max Verstappen and Red Bull for probably the next 4 or 5 years.
Yep.
And
which they absolutely don't want to do.
Yeah, and that's going to eat them up, right? So they got to figure out a way to make either their team more competitive or they got to go to a team that's more competitive. So really intriguing to see what will take place.
And as we heard in the last season of DTS, as much as a lot of it is hyped up for the drama, some of those other key teams have expressed interest in those other drivers. Like, remember before Monaco, Red Bull was kind of like, do we want to renew Sergio's contract? Do we not? Christian Horner mentioned Lando Norris by name. I can't really imagine him going there. Again, I'm just so used to seeing him at McLaren, but I would not be shocked were he to move to a different team where he felt he had the opportunity should McLaren continue down the road that they're on.
Yeah, and I think like the next ball to really move is like when does Lewis retire? When does Checo retire?
Yep.
And then when does Alonso retire too, right? Because those are kind of the 3 guys that are older in the league or in F1. They've been there for a while and they have very prominent seats, right?
Yep.
So we'll see how the driver shakeup goes there. But good news on the McLaren side, you signed like your 1,000th sponsor of the year.
Our 47th, actually.
Oh, 47. My apologies. So Workday and McLaren Racing have agreed to a multi-year partnership. Well, McLaren will use their financial planning software to empower its employees through better financial planning, forecasting, and also while enhancing transparency, simplicity, and adaptability across the organization. I just think it's ironic because they did not spend their money well at all during the development of the car. So Workday is going to have to help them quite a bit.
Yeah, that was my feelings too. I was like, well, I'm sure that financial planning and forecasting would have been appreciated like a year ago when we were in the middle of these conversations, but it's crazy. I was shocked. There was that graphic of how many sponsors each team has. And I know we made fun of some of the cars when we were looking at the designs earlier this year for how many logos they had in the placement of them. But this is an absurd number. And I mean, I guess they would have to have those digital panels in order to showcase everyone.
Yeah, otherwise, how else are you going to show everybody when you don't have, when you don't know? You have that's the digital panels are needed.
You physically can't do it. There is not enough real estate on that car otherwise. So I guess it makes sense now, but at the same time, wish some of that money had been poured more into the car design as opposed to finding more ways to get sponsors on it.
Oh,
So
I love that we were thinking the same thing there. That's so good.
you and me, we have always been like this.
I totally agree. I totally agree. Now, I wonder if we think the same thing on this next case. So, Stefano Domenicali is back at it again. Yes, the CEO of Formula One has kind of come out and made an interesting statement about free practice, saying that he's a supporter of cancellation of free practice sessions, which are of great use to the engineer, but the public doesn't like. I can't stand this guy.
I think that's BS. So having gone to a race weekend now, first and foremost, typically the days where you're doing free practice are cheaper than the race day. And if you're trying to find ways to get people involved or, you know, like I just think about like young families with little kids, like a race is a very intense experience. Like it was loud. There was not just from the cars, but the yelling, like it would be kind of like a fun, inclusive way to get your kids there. It's a little less busy at the park. You could get that next generation of fans going from an in-person experience. I'm sure the TV revenue isn't the same except for like very intense fans. Like I watch them sometimes, stuff like that, but I don't think you get the quality of racing that you look for, especially with qualifying and sprint weekends, if you don't have the data that the engineers are getting from the free practice sessions. So if anything, maybe just don't televise them if you're worried about interest in that regard, but I still think they should happen and also be open to the public to attend if they would like to.
But yeah, and like Erica, as kind of I was looking at a newer fan of Formula One, where I learned all my technical information is like listening to free practice and the commentary that is there, right? Because that's when they can talk about the cars. They can talk about what the new upgrade packages look like. They talk about the aerodynamics of what, you know, maybe internally what they've done from race to race to kind of upgrade their performance. And I think it's a little bollocks considering this guy wants 30 races a season.
Yeah.
He's just worried. He just wants the TV revenue in a way. And he's probably wanting to get rid of the free practice sessions so that he could add more race weekends while having to, you know, reduce the traveling time. But as you alluded to, like, my opinion, free practice sessions are critical to get your car tuned up for a quality race and a quality, like, you know, sprint qualifying, whatever, or just quality in general. I mean, you're going to hurt your product.
Yeah.
But so, you know, any team, MLB, NHL, NBA, they practice.
Yeah.
And this is really their only time in between race weeks to practice and get a load of the circuit, you know, new tires. I don't understand this. Again, this is coming from a dollar sign. He's a bit of an idiot, in my opinion, but it is what it is.
And I'm just thinking, because I'm sure he's like, well, the drivers can get to know the tracks in a simulator. But as we saw with Lance Stroll the first week, when Aston Martin was really like, oh yeah, he's good to go. It's very different when you're in that car and you're pulling G's versus being in a sim. And I even think from like a safety standpoint, like say, it's going to be a rainy weekend, like you can test out those inters, you can test out the wet tires just to make sure things are good to go. Like I think from a driver safety point too, that's kind of the way to go.
I'd
And
be
also
curious to
don't
s-
tell me that it doesn't make money, because they ran out of souls on the very first day in Montreal last year before FP1 even happened. Like the only beer you could get in the entire stadium after about 11 a.m. was Heineken.
Oh my gosh. Which is still a good beer, but I understand.
Still good beer, but like you like to have variety if you're
Oh,
going
for
to have a
sure.
couple beers throughout the day, right? And you couldn't get Sol. We went up and they were like, we are already out. I was like, it's not even lunchtime. How is this possible? But here we are.
Yeah, I don't know. I can't take what this guy says seriously really anymore, especially when he just creates these radical ideas of, again, we go back to the 30 race seasons. It's just I get you're trying to attract a more casual fan, but as you alluded to earlier, Eric, it's cheaper. You can bring more casual fans to free practice, and there's probably more action at free practice sometimes than there are going to be in a qualifying session or even the race.
Yeah, the cars are a little bit more spaced out, so you actually get to see everyone go around, as opposed to like so much happening in front of you for 30 seconds and then nothing for like a minute and a half until they come back around, right? So I don't know. I think from both a fan standpoint and from a technical standpoint, important to keep.
Oh, very good point. So that was the week that was in F1. Great review there. Now we're going to do our quick kind of 2-minute review on the Aussie GP. Erica, who do you see winning, and why is it Max Verstappen?
I was going to say, I was like, is it really a question at this point? I see Red Bull 1-2 again. I don't think that's a shock.
They
That
could start out in like the middle of Melbourne and like still win.
Like we saw Max last week starting midway through the grid, and already so far, what was it? I think Alonso joked that by lap 25, Max would be back up, and he was like literally lap 25 or whatever it was, on the money. Perez is showing strength and confidence in this car as well, with some very good showings in the last 2 races. I have some questions about the reliability, because we did hear Max going back and forth with his team saying that there was something wrong with the drive shaft and they were telling him everything was okay, but he didn't seem on point. But it's Red Bull. They had reliability issues last year, nipped it in the bud immediately. I have no reason to believe that they wouldn't do the same thing again to get things in order for Australia. And then third place, some San Fernando Alonso, because that's just making sense with everything that we're seeing. We know that it's not going to be Mercedes there because they don't have the pace in the car. We don't think we're going to see Ferrari either, because I don't think they have the pace in the car. And I don't quite think Lance Stroll is ready to duke it out for a podium finish. So I don't see why we need to change the formula of the last 2 weeks.
They can start doing their own kind of talk show in the app, kind of in that cool down room, because that's, again, I agree. It's going to be those 3 people: Max P1, Checo P2, Alonso P3. I'm kind of waiting for that moment when Max and Checo have a racing incident similar to Lewis and Nico.
Or similar to Ricardo and Verstappen back in the day.
It's happened, right? It happens, and it could happen again. There are some tight turns, and obviously it's a street circuit, so it's going to be tight in a way. They made Albert Park faster, which is great to see. But I think that bodes well for Red Bull this week, and hopefully, I think Ferrari could do well. They just have to avoid the gravel traps, obviously. Speaking to Mr. Carlos Sainz, of course, but Carlos. But nevertheless, I don't think we're going to see any changes until Azerbaijan, until when teams start to bring their upgrades.
Yeah, I would agree. I also just think on the Ferrari side, Charles and Xavi are having a moment, and I don't know that that'll be rectified by the weekend. So
I mean, like, this is a perfect spot for Red Bull to maximize their points out of the gate here, because both their competitors in Ferrari and Mercedes are having pretty significant issues for competing for P1 in that constructor. So this is really a time to maximize their points, get out a jump lead. Obviously, you think that with the upgrades coming over the years or over the year, especially with the reduction in wind tunnel timing compared to the other 2 teams that Red Bull have, their car is going to get closer in the field. But when you're beating teams by 30 seconds at a race, like how much upgrade is going to really justify adjustments in that. So I think Red Bull are going to have it on lock again, unless something drastically happens, as you mentioned, through reliability, or they crash into each other.
Which, you know, we'll see, because those are usually split-second decisions in the moment where someone gets a little heated and makes a judgment call that may or may not result in a thorough thrashing over the microphone.
Mhm.
So
On that note, then, thank you, Erica, so much for this wonderful episode this week.
thank you,
Again,
Gary.
hoping John's doing well. Everyone just wants John's doing well, just a little busy, so hopefully his week's going well too. And then with that said, please follow us on Instagram. Please follow us on Spotify and Apple Podcasts, where you can listen to season 3, episode 6 of the Jetta GP review, where John and I, the whole team, go over kind of our thoughts and review of the race that happened in Saudi a couple of weeks ago. But also follow us at X3 Cheese YouTube channel too. So, Erica, I always send it off, but why don't you send it off this week?
Thank you, everyone, for listening to season 3, episode 7 of the F1 podcast. As Cleary mentioned, you can follow us on Instagram at f1.podcast, as well as find us on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and YouTube. You can join us next week as we review the Australian GP and gear up for the rest of the season. And we are excited to have you back. And hopefully all 3 of us will be with us next time. Take care, and we'll all talk soon.